I think that capacity for growth is true of all the people that I have written about. They all become someone so much greater than you could possibly have imagined.
My books would not exist, would not be possible without today's guest. Ron Chernow is a prize-winning author, won the National Book Award. He's won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. And then Hamilton is, of course, the inspiration for the musical.
Hamilton and Twain were gifts for the biographer because they were not in control of themselves.
Yes.
There's more drama if they're not Stoics.
This is the real cost of ill discipline, right?
People were looking to him for leadership, and he realized that in order to command people, he had to acquire command over himself.
When you'd have to practice your Stoicism, which is not let it get to you.
If you deny the past, if you try to wipe out the past does catch up with you. I found myself, after reading your daily Stoic meditations, thinking about Mark Twain very differently, because
I felt like actually Grant, Washington, and Rockefeller all would be lowercase Stoics in that sort of 18th century, 19th century way of being in command of oneself.
Right.
And that sort of passion or the passions was something to be wary of. Hamilton's the opposite, but they were striving to be masters of themselves.
Right. I have to say, right. You know, Hamilton and Twain were gifts for the biographer because they were not in control of themselves.
Yes.
There's more drama if they're not Stoics.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. And that was really kind of by happenstance, not by design, that I happened to write about a series of people with tremendous self-control and self-restraint, and that was a big part of their success.
Well, I found that very striking in Washington. You were, I forget which sculptor it was, but it's a sculptor that spends hours and hours with Washington realizes that the myth of Washington as a person with a great amount of equanimity and poise was somewhat misleading.
Yeah, it was actually Gilbert Stuart, the painter. Gilbert Stuart did 120 portraits of Washington. He used to call them his $100 bills, because that's how much he charged. And he made the very interesting statement that if Washington had been in the forest, he would have been the fiercest among the savage tribes. So he says that there was another personality under the surface.
Well, and in a way, though, that makes it more impressive, because if you are naturally chill, and then we're not talking about self-discipline. We're talking about some inherited trait. It's that there was a temper to tame that makes Washington truly a Stoic. Right,
absolutely. If I may, can I read some of these? Because I think that for people who would aspire to be a Stoic, but who would say to themselves, well, you know, my nature is basically emotional and passionate and irrational, and I could never do it. That in the case of George Washington, the Stoicism was definitely something achieved, something that he wasn't born with.
Yes.
And I have in the introduction to the book a number of quite extraordinary quotes from people who knew Washington very well. And behind that image of the marble man, this is what they saw. Thomas Jefferson said his temper was naturally high-toned, in other words, high-strung. But reflection and resolution had obtained a firm and habitual ascendancy over it. If, however, it broke its bonds, he was most tremendous in wrath. John Adams concurred. He had great self-command, but to preserve so much equanimity as he did required a great capacity. Whenever he lost his temper, as he did sometimes, either love or fear in those about him induced them to conceal his weakness from the world. Gouverneur Morris agreed that Washington, quote, had the tumultuous passions which accompany greatness and frequently tarnish its luster. With them was his first contest, and his first victory was over himself. Yet those who have seen him strongly moved will bear witness that his wrath was terrible. And so here was a man whose enormous amount of emotion churning in front of him, and he did not feel that he had, particularly as his life went on, that he had the opportunity to indulge that.
Yeah.
People were looking to him for leadership, And he realized that in order to command people, he had to acquire command over himself. But I should say, Ron, that everyone around George Washington felt this tremendous force of personality.
Yes.
They could feel the passion
Yes.
that was under this tight control, and that kind of kept other people off balance a little bit.
Well, I think people think that someone who is Stoic or lowercase Stoic is unfeeling and invulnerable
Right.
and boring and resigned. I think it's so the Stoicism of all the founders, I think, because they were all sort of steeped in those classical ideas.
Yeah.
It totally obliterates the notion that it's this sort of passive, resigned philosophy. I mean, they created a new nation. They literally made something new. Someone who's resigned isn't going to do that.
That's right. Revolutionaries by nature are passionate individuals. Otherwise, they would not have been able to do it. But also very interesting about Washington was that Washington was not a reader the way that a Jefferson or a Hamilton was. He has a lot of books that you can see at Mount Vernon. They're mostly pretty boring books on agriculture. But he imbibed an enormous amount through the theater. In fact, when he was a delegate in colonial Williamsburg before the American Revolution, there were 2 theater companies in town. It said that when one was playing, he might go to the theater 5 to 7 nights a week. And of course, his favorite play was Joseph Addison's Cato. So we're talking, I think, 1712.
Yeah.
And there were all of these lines from Cato that he repeated. In fact, he had Cato performed at Valley Forge. So he obviously thought that there was something very, very inspirational about that play. And there were lines like, he wanted to see things through the calm light of mild philosophy. And it was always an ideal. It was not something that was easy to achieve, because Washington was always in the midst of so much controversy.
Yeah.
Occasionally his self-command would break down. But it was also amazing how frequently he rose above the fray. He becomes president. He has Jefferson and Hamilton are engaged in this ferocious and sometimes pathological opposition with each other. But he imagined that he embodied the nation and had to live up to a certain, ideal of what you have pointed out in your writings, courage, temperance, wisdom, perseverance. Am I getting the 4?
Justice.
Justice, right, yeah. So that was exactly a description of George Washington. But this was something, again, that was earned. It was achieved over many years. And he didn't have, there wasn't a Ryan Holiday in his life. This was something that he just achieved by himself.
Yeah, but I think your point that play is sort of in the zeitgeist is there. I mean, I've joked that it was the Hamilton of its day.
Yes.
And everyone knew it. They could quote it. It was just there.
Right. No, exactly. And since they couldn't quote from British plays, particularly during the Revolutionary War, they went back to the ancients. And you have in your book on the Daily Stoic Meditation, my God, you start out with an epigraph that I wish I had known 50 years ago. And it's an epigraph, I think, from Seneca.
Yeah.
And he's talking about the fact that we have the opportunity to annex past ages. We don't have to feel trapped just in our own time. We can time travel, and there's a beautiful line, that we can, harvest the store of riches from the past. I guess, Ryan, that's what I do for a living. I mean, I have inhabited multiple centuries, and I've never seen that expressed quite so beautifully.
Well, actually, the founding of Stoicism, it's founded in the 4th century by this guy named Zeno, who's a merchant. And he, as a young man, he'd visited the oracle at Delphi. And the Delphi had told him, or the oracle had told him that the secret to the good life was to begin to have conversations with the dead.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know what this means for many years. And it's not until he suffers a shipwreck and he washes up in Athens and he passes this bookseller in the Athenian Agora who's reading from Xenophon the story of the choice of Hercules, which we hear from Socrates.
Yeah.
And Socrates is at this point dead. And so is Xenophon. And it strikes Zeno that this is what it means to have conversations with the dead, that reading and books are a way to converse with the dead. And that's, I think, why we call philosophy the great conversation, and probably what is so magical about living with a Grant or Washington or Hamilton or a Twain for probably a decade on each one of these books that you...
Yeah, they typically take about 5 or 6 years. I've often joked about my love affair with the dead, because I'd started out as a journalist for almost 10 years. Then I started writing about these books, and people would ask me just about my choice of subject. And I would say, I like them dead, nice and dead. They don't sue you. They don't tell their friends not to cooperate. They don't write nasty letters to you after the book comes out. But for me, my communication with these figures has really been through their words. There are certain people, I see in your bookstore, you have all, Bob Caro's books. I remember when Bob Caro was writing about Lyndon Johnson in the Hill Country, he slept in a backpack. For 2 years. That's not Ron Chernow style. I wish it was. I find that there are certain historians that kind of going to the places and dealing with the artifacts brings them closer to the figure. For me, my communication with them is through language. I find that people, for me, reveal themselves through language more than anything else, not just the content of the language, but the style of the language. That's how I absorb them into my bloodstream. But that quote from Seneca just made me realize how lucky it was that my life has really straddled 2 or 3 centuries.
Yes. Yeah, mine too. It's like an interesting way to think about it might be like, what's your reading age? Not like what age do you read at, but like how many centuries have you absorbed into your own life? Because the idea of however long you live, that's the full breadth of your experience, is so insanely limited if you think about the fact that there are, 5,000 or so years of like recorded literate history that you can mainline, and that there's an endless amount of it. And then I think one of the remarkable things about your books, but also when you go back to the primary text, is that sure, the past is a foreign country, but also the people are exactly the same, and how human and relatable much of the things they're dealing with is.
Human nature never changes. In fact, someone once asked Mark Twain, how he knew so much about human nature, and had he gone out and studied it. And he made, I thought, a very revealing comment. He said, no, I just have to study myself. He felt that every human being contained every, human emotion. I think it's true. He ended up developing a rather dim view of human nature.
Sure.
In fact, even though he was very much a political activist and crusader in his later years, he really didn't feel that good government was possible, because human nature was so flawed. We were all trapped within our skin. All of these figures that I've written about, I just feel so damn lucky to have been in the company of figures who are so much greater than myself.
Yes. Well, that quote from Gouverneur Morris about Washington is such an interesting one, that his first contest was with himself, and his first victory was over himself. To me, that's what I think most of us are striving to do. We all have urges and desires. We have flaws. We have kind of a lower self and a higher self. And to get to some level of greatness or to realize our potential, it's that battle. I'm sure with you, you don't want to write every day. So, there's hard things that you should do, but you don't want to do, or easy or fun or pleasurable things you might like to do that are not good for you. And that battle is, if you lose that battle, you're probably not going to win the other battles.
Yeah, it was interesting. Someone asked me the other day if there was a common denominator to the people I've written about. And one of the things that I mentioned was that in every single person that I've written about, there has been a difficult or domineering or distant or even absentee parent. Usually in the case of these men I've written about, it's usually father, although in the case of George Washington, it was not only that his father died when George was young, but he had an extremely difficult mother. And so all of them, I think, first learned to govern their emotions.
Yeah.
in dealing with this very kind of difficult and unpredictable parent, because with a parent you obviously don't have the option of walking away, and how you resolve that. Some people resolve it very violently by kind of breaking off with their parents. I think there's a danger with it. There was another quote that I loved that you had in your daily Stoic meditations. Was it from Seneca? It was about, in planning for the future, that has to descend from the past. And people are always asking me about Hamilton. I'll never escape from Hamilton at this point. Hamilton shut the door on his past.
Yeah.
There may be, his writings are voluminous, there may be only one or two sentences that even obliquely refer to his past. And when I was doing the book, I ran into a famous Wall Street analyst, my friend Byron Wien. Byron was the only orphan I knew. And Hamilton was technically an orphan. I mean, his mother died when he was 11, then the father abandons the family, so technically he's an orphan. So I ran into Byron, and I said, Byron, you're the only orphan I know. I'm writing about a famous orphan. What do I need to know about orphans? And he said, what you need to know, Ron, is you reinvent yourself and never look back. So I said, thank you. You've just encapsulated my entire book in one sentence. The problem is that people who do that, and Hamilton certainly do it, you pay a price for it.
Yes.
I think our foundational emotions really stem from childhood. If you slam the door on that and then try to create another personality that has no real connection or relationship to it, it's unstable. And what I felt with Hamilton makes him so interesting to write about, not to mention to dramatize for Lin-Manuel Miranda, is like there's this enormous kind of superstructure of thought and accomplishment. It's all resting on a very kind of fragile base. He doesn't have that emotional foundation. He's decided, he not only never talks about the past. You think, for instance, he would want to take his children back to, Nevis and St. Croix to see where, there's never a thought of that. He is in some kind of loose communication with his father and his brother, but it does... If you deny the past, if you try to wipe out the past does catch up with you.
That is the problem, I think, with the stereotype of Stoicism being about the repression of emotion. I think the operative phrase for Washington is actually that line from Cato where it says, look at everything in the calm light of mild philosophy. He's not saying you don't have the feeling. He's not saying it's this process of processing and getting perspective and working it out, as opposed to vomiting it on other people or stuffing it in a closet where it does eventually come. Yeah, because so much of Hamilton's sort of biggest mistakes are, I think, someone who, today would be in therapy. He's so motivated in a reaction against what he went through and trying not to go back into that place. There's this kind of bottomless pit or this wound that that makes him immensely vulnerable. So he thinks by stuffing it down, you think you're making yourself invulnerable, but in fact you're making yourself really vulnerable.
And then what happens with Hamilton, anyone who's read the book or who's watched the musical knows, there does come a moment where it all catches up with him, and it's with this woman, Maria Reynolds. Yeah. Because Hamilton is very happily married, but this woman, Maria Reynolds, literally shows up on his doorstep when Eliza is off visiting her father in Albany, and she claims she's been abandoned by her father, and can he help her out financially? And suddenly, the dark undertow of the past starts dragging him back into what was really a very kind of slavish and compulsive relationship with this woman. He not only can break away from her sexual arts, whatever they were, but then the husband appears. Yeah. He starts extorting this money from Hamilton, actually in Hamilton's office at the Treasury Department. I mean, this is an amazing story. Aside from Washington, not only the most powerful person in the country, but he was clearly the most controversial person. So he knew that his every move was being watched. He knew that there were a lot of people who were ready to take him down, but he can't seem to break away from this.
So he wants so desperately to be wanted. I think the idea of turning away someone that wanted him.
Yeah, and she knew exactly how to play, and he was very, very vulnerable. But here is someone, in his political life, my God, I've written about some extraordinary people, but in certain ways, he was in a class by himself. He was, he was so brilliant. When he would write an essay, people would watch him. He would pace in the garden. His lips would be moving. He was kind of working out his mind. He would then take a nap. He would wake up from the nap, and he'd sit down and he would write the essay. He didn't have to change a word after that. This is a man with a beautifully organized mind. When he was writing the Federalist Papers, there are 85 of them, he wrote 51. He sometimes wrote as many as 3 or 4 or 5 per week, and he had full-time legal practice. And he's able to do it. And there's like a lot of information. There's a lot of research in it. He didn't have time to do the research. That's all it had to be. So this is a man with really the most beautifully organized, logical mind imaginable. But then underneath it, there is this sea.
He's a scared little boy who was abandoned.
Who was abandoned. And suddenly this episode happens that drags him back into it. Boy, I wish I could have spoken to him about that, because he must have been aware of the contradiction, aware of the craziness, that this was happening. He pays a terrible price. He has this loyal, long-suffering wife whom he humiliates. And then he does something very, very interesting, because the Reynolds affair comes to light. Even his closest friends realized he had to make a statement.
Yeah.
Even his closest friends thought that a nice short paragraph or 2 would have done the trick. And he sits down and he writes, I think it was a 90-page pamphlet about it. Again, what that says to me, if I were going to psychoanalyze him, was that as a boy, he felt very insecure. After all, kind of poor family. He was illegitimate, which was a big thing in those days. And so he is overreacting.
Let me explain myself. Let me explain.
Yeah, and
so insecure.
And he can't stop himself. And actually, this is true with Mark Twain, too. With Mark Twain and Alexander Hamilton, their greatest strength, their greatest weapon is words.
Yeah.
And whenever they work, they resort to really sort of voluminous attacks on people without, realizing that is not going to end the feud. That's going to just open the feud.
Yeah.
Further. It's a mistake, again, my Rockefeller granted. Washington would not have made that mistake. They would have felt the emotions. I'll tell you one interesting interesting about George Washington. When I started doing the book, I went off to Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon has a very interesting file. Okay, Washington comes back from the Revolutionary War in 1783. He doesn't go off to Washington to be president until 1789. So there are these years at Mount Vernon, and they have a file that was kept that everyone, he had every night for dinner, he would have like 10 or 20 people there. And needless to say, everyone who came to dinner with George Washington left in a letter or diary some record of what he was like.
Yeah.
Some kind of reading them, you could almost every night in chronological order. One person would say, had dinner with the general last night. It was the most boring evening I've ever spent. He scarcely spent a word. There were long silences. He was very dull. The next night, had dinner with General Washington. He told one fascinating anecdote after another about the revolution. It was the most amazing evening of my life. It was a great storytelling. And I started reading this and think to myself, what is this? This doesn't sound like the same person.
Yeah.
He was a different person. And then I figured out what it was. And this has to do with self-command. He was very good at reading people. He had amazing intuitions. I guess most politicians do. Are you for me or against me? And here were people he knew at the dinner table. They would often be strangers at the dinner table. But I realized he would sort of look around the dinner table and he would wonder, how much can I trust this person? If he trusted everyone around the dinner table, he was perfectly happy to open up and tell them all these stories. If he kind of spotted someone whose motives he was suspicious of, he was able to close up. But he had that kind of control over himself, as well as quite extraordinary instincts, if there was any danger.
Well, there's a story from Plutarch, so maybe Washington would have known it, certainly Hamilton would have known it, where he it's about a Spartan general who's sitting at a dinner and everyone's talking and he doesn't say anything the whole dinner. And finally someone goes, "You haven't said anything. What, are you stupid or something?" And he says, "A stupid person wouldn't have been able to sit here silently." and there's something about having something to say and being able to not say it. The command,
of knowing,
hey, this
right
isn't going to go
moment.
well. I don't need to say this. Actually, it's better left unsaid. That I think Washington mastered, that Hamilton certainly didn't. His word, as much as his words were his weapon or were his rocket ship, they're also always constantly getting him in trouble, as for Twain as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that Alexander Hamilton was so brilliant, and he was never able to resist an opportunity to show that brilliant. He was always the smartest guy in the room. And that got him into trouble. And there are a lot of people, they feel that they have to fill a silence. They feel they have to fill a conversational void. In fact, I remember, Mike Wallace, who was a famous interviewer for CBS, would pick this up in people. And he would ask questions. Then if there was a long silence, instead of filling it, he would wait for the person to do it. Because usually if there's a silence, someone will get nervous and say, "I better say something." And that's when they're prone to make a mistake, and then they'll babble. I kind of feel this in myself. So sometimes I like to keep the conversation, going. Yes, I've written about two very different types of people. I have to say with, Mark Twain, having written, because the book's immediately preceding, were Ulysses the taciturn and George the reticent. Yeah. And suddenly I have Mark the talkative. I felt it was a great gift in my life. And I kept thinking as I was reading your daily Stoic meditations, I think that my Washington, my Grant, my Rockefeller books are inspirational to the extent that they're guides to succeed in life. Maybe not in Rockefeller, you could disagree with, his desire to create this very sort of rich and powerful, but whatever. But the fact that he did what he set out to do, and he created the largest business enterprise in the world, probably the largest fortune in history, he did it. And so I felt that the people that I had written about, and Hamilton would be part of this too, I felt that most of the people that I had written for were built for success, except for Grant. Yes. Except for Grant, because Grant, when people would ask me, "Why did you write about Ulysses S. Grant?" Well, there was kind of a variety of reasons, but I had written about so many people who were cut out for success. I mean, like anyone, even if you didn't know the story of Alexander Hamilton, by around page 50, you would say, this guy's going to do something.
He's going places.
This guy's like shot out of a cannon. Yeah. This guy is so smart. He's so ambitious. He's so energetic. Whereas by page 50 with U.S. Grant, if you didn't know how the story ended, you'd say, this guy's going to at best end up a footnote in history. He's going to remain obscure. And he fails at one thing after another. When he's in his 30s finally, I mean, he had gone to West Point and fought in the Mexican War. He's in his 30s. He's working in a farm. His father's given land outside of St. Louis. He's failed as a father. It's a very sad story. In order to survive, he has to walk beside this wagon every day into St. Louis, where he sells firewood on street corners. He runs into an old army buddy. Grant looks very disheveled and beaten down, and the friend says to him, "My God, Grant, what are you doing?" And he says, "I'm solving the problem of poverty." And, one Christmas he has to pawn his watch in order to buy presents for the kids. And then finally, in what must have felt like the ultimate humiliation, he goes to work for his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, where he's junior to his two younger brothers. Yeah. All of us younger brothers must know how that must have, felt for him, that he was kind of at the bottom. And then the Civil War breaks out. Grant is almost 40, and suddenly there's a desperate need for officers. There's a desperate need for people who have any kind of military knowledge or experience. And then Grant starts to soar, but he suddenly kind of meshes with his historical moment. And
don't you think the through line there is that as dark as it got and as humiliating as it was, like when he says, I'm solving the problem of poverty, I don't get the sense that he was that humiliated. There's something about, like, part of what Stoicism is about seeing things objectively.
Yeah.
If you think status is important, if you think what other people think is important, then yeah, selling firewood by the side of the road when you were an officer from West Point and a war hero, that's humiliating. If you think your job as a father is to provide for your family and honest labor is honest labor, that's a different way of thinking about it. Grant's strength to me is not just his determination, but his kind of objectivity. Ultimately, the Union triumphs, but it doesn't look like it's going to triumph for a good chunk of the war. But for Grant, both at that level and then in his individual battles, never seemed to think things were as bad as everyone else thought them to be. He's just not rattled. He's just doing what he has to do. And he's kind of objective about it. And that's kind of his key strength.
Yeah, and there is a determination about Grant, almost kind of a relentlessness about Grant in achieving a goal. One of the things that he had, I'll tell you kind of two stories. One, when Grant was a boy, he was always very good. He was a famous horseman. Yeah. When he's a boy, I think he was maybe 8 or 10 years old, his father takes him to a circus. And there was this circus act that people in the crowd, the circus ring, were invited to get on this horse. This was a very powerful, fast horse, but a wild horse. People were invited to get on the horse and see if they could stay on the horse. And the horse would circle the ring faster and faster and faster. And most people were quickly thrown off the horse. Grant was not. But then what happened, if someone managed to stay on the horse, the ringmaster would then release this monkey that would jump up onto the rider's shoulders. Yeah. So picture this kid with this powerful horse circling the ring under him and this monkey standing on his shoulder.
And how many people in Galena, Illinois has even seen a monkey?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, that kind of coolness,
yes,
that kind of command. I mean, another one of my favorite Grant stories in terms of his coolness, when he was at the Wilderness, which was a terrible, bloody Civil War battle. There's one moment where a shell kind of whizzes like inches from his ear, and Grant doesn't flinch, and he says to his aide, "Get that shell, let's see what they're firing at."
Isn't there a scene where he goes up to Sherman after the Battle of Shiloh, where they've just gotten destroyed, and he says, well, look at tomorrow. So there's some part of him, it's determination fused with a kind of even keelness that isn't accepting that things are as bad as they look. The amount of determination you would have to think that you're at rock bottom and claw your way up is different than the determination Grant has, which is like, he's always like, it's even odds. Like he doesn't seem to accept the premise that he's getting his ass kicked or that it's insurmountable.
Now, in fact, kind of one of the famous statements that William Tecumseh Sherman made about Grant, Sherman probably knew Grant as a military man better than anyone else. He said that Grant always had a faith in victory that I could only liken to the faith that a Christian has in his Savior. You know, he always knew that he was going to win. In fact, that great line, because it was the first night at Shiloh, the Union troops had gotten badly whipped. And Sherman finds, Grant standing under a tree. It's raining. The water's dripping from the brim of Grant's hat. And Sherman says to him, "Well, Grant, we had the devil's own David today." And then Sherman says, "Look him tomorrow." Interestingly enough, General Davis Petraeus, during the surge in Iraq, packed in his suitcase a book called Grant Takes Command by Bruce Catton.
One of our greatest historians.
Yeah, and he said that one of the lines he used most frequently with his troops was "Look him tomorrow."
Yeah.
This kind of never say die spirit. And actually, Grant, from the time that he was young, he had a superstition that lasted throughout his life of never turning back.
Yeah.
Never turning back. And this is certainly true in the Civil War. One of my favorite stories in the book is that, under previous generals of the Army of the Potomac, they'd crossed the Rapidan into Virginia. They'd been whipped by Lee, and then licking their wounds, had gone back to Washington. Well, at the end of the second night at the Wilderness, very bloody battle. The forest was set on fire. It was gruesome. The troops are told to get ready, that they're moving out at night. And this was the Army of the Potomac, and they were convinced that, based on previous experiences, they were going to arrive at this crossroads, and they would turn left, which means going north and going back to Washington in defeat. And they're kind of marching at night, and then suddenly they get to this crossroads, and they're all wheeling around to the right, which means they're marching south to Richmond. And you would think that these soldiers maybe would be disappointed because it meant more fighting.
Yeah.
But they were tremendously inspirational. Oh, my God, we're going on to Richmond. And one of the soldiers said about Grant, Atulus, you don't scare a damn. And that kind of courage really filters down to the people below in leadership. It's very, very interesting. I've seen this particularly now, having written about two generals, and Grant was a much greater general than Washington was. But Washington was a great kind of political figure at the head of the army. Grant was much more of a tactician and strategist. But people can read their leaders, very well. And Grant had a courage and a clarity about what he wanted. And Lincoln had this funny statement, very true, about Grant. He said that Grant was like a bulldog who will chew and choke, and won't let go. And that was really true, that when Grant decided that he was going to go to Richmond, that was it. Even Robert E. Lee, one of Lee's generals, said to him how poorly Grant was doing. And Lee said, oh, no, I think actually Grant is doing very well. And he said, if he keeps pushing us back to Richmond, it'll be a siege, and then it's all over.
Yeah, Grant, I'm going to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. He sort of distills it down to its essence. We've got more manpower.
Yeah.
Like, they have to control the territory. We can replace, we've got the material and the sort of economic might behind us. If we just don't quit, we'll win.
Yeah, and Lincoln saw that quality in Grant, and he felt that all of the other generals would sort of make excuses and, I need more men, I need more material, we have to review the troops, the timing is not right. And Grant was someone who took personal responsibility. I think that this is, true of just about all the people that I have written about. Responsibility, it's almost a kind of, fatherly or motherly quality that they had. And I think that, again, something that unites the people I've written about, clarity of purpose, a single-mindedness, and then being able to sort of mobilize all of their emotions to the achievement of that goal.
My favorite Grant story in your book is the one where he decides he's always been opposed to slavery, but then he inherits a slave through his wife. And at what we would, I think, have said was his lowest ebb. He's basically broke.
Yeah.
He's pulling out stumps and trying to, by hand, clear this horrendous field, when he could have desperately needed the labor or desperately needed the money that the property was worth. At some level, Grant's like, I don't think slavery is right. I don't want to own a slave. I'm going to give this person there's no mental process of rationalization, expediency. Well, it boils down to something very simple. What is the right thing to do here? And he does that right thing, even though not only must it have meant an incredible amount of work and struggle for him, but I'm sure everyone else was telling him no one was throwing him a parade for doing this. At the time, it was seen as probably the height of his foolhardiness.
No, absolutely. And Grant could desperately have used the money. One of the things I loved writing about Grant, and I think it's so important, today, with Grant, there was never this kind of beating his chest, look at me.
Yeah.
He just did what he was doing, going about his business, doing his duty. That's real patriotism.
Yes.
Not doing it for egotistical reasons, but he really had a sense of service and duty and honor, and he never called attention to himself. There's a famous story that I tell in the book that makes the point when Lincoln called him to Washington to become the chief of all the armies, he goes to Willard's Hotel and goes up to the desk and asks for a room, and they're about to, send him to a little room in the attic. Then he signs his name in the register, and suddenly the clerk says, "Oh my God, it's General Grant." And they gave him, I think, the room that Lincoln had occupied at the time of his inauguration. But there's never a moment where Grant says, "I'm Ulysses S. Grant."
Yes.
He's never sort of flaunting his power. He would wear pretty much same uniform as the privates and the army. And I think that today is really an example of the kind of patriotism that we, need. We have a political world where people are so constantly calling attention to how wonderful they are. And here was someone who was just doing it for the good of the country, who was not looking for personal glory.
There's a story I tell in one of my books about Grant. I think Grant tells it in his memoir. He was supposed to go meet some other general, and that general was one of those fussy dressers, very about the uniform, about the spit and polish. And so Grant decides to get dressed up to put that person at ease. And then that person, hearing that Grant is relaxed and doesn't care about these things, decides to dress down. And then they show up and they're, what? But there is something fundamentally unassuming about Grant that I think is actually the through line. Grant, what are you doing? You're humiliating yourself. And he says, "I'm solving the problem of poverty," is the same sort of, what do you mean you're selling, this slave, you're giving this slave your freedom. It's worth thousands of dollars. There's nothing wrong with slavery. Yeah. And he says, it's the right thing. There's just something, there's a simplicity and an unaffectedness to it that is pure and very beautiful.
Yeah. I found myself, after reading your daily Stoic meditations, thinking about Mark Twain very differently.
Yeah.
Because I think the other books that I've written, maybe Hamilton would be the exception, had these people who had exceptional self-control. Yeah. And seeing Mark Twain through the lens of Stoicism, he could have used, a good class in Stoicism, because he was somebody who was very impetuous, and somebody whom I think was often very much the captive of his emotions. And I spent a lot of time in the book, for instance, talking about his relationship with his wonderful wife, Livy. And as Twain himself admitted when he met Livy, he said, "I was a mighty rough, coarse customer." And he said, "Livy edited my manuscripts and then she edited me," which was true. And Livy really had to train him in what we would call today anger management.
Yeah.
Because he had a tendency to very kind of quickly lash out at people. So
it's like every single one of his relationships or friendships, with very few exceptions, ended badly, and with him feeling like he was massively aggrieved in some way.
Yeah, he would start out by falling in love with people, and then he would become very, very disillusioned with them and irritable with them, and Livy trained him when he wrote an angry letter, which he was wont to do, to put it in the drawer, or kind of, write a cooler one when his head calmed down a bit. There are a lot of letters from Mark Twain in his files the morning after a dinner party. "Dear Madam, my wife tells me I might have been a little sharp and brusque with you at dinner last night. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean it." He often didn't realize the effect that he had on people. He was so sharp and so, funny. And to the point where they ended up having this card system at dinner parties. So if, a red card from Livy meant, "Are you going to keep monopolizing that woman on your right?" Blue card might be, "Are you going to sit there saying nothing all night?" She really, again, he was from the small backwater town in Missouri, and she really made him presentable in polite society. He did not quite know how to do it. I think that she had a limited effect in terms of, controlling his anger.
But even doing that work is, I mean, not everyone does that, right? Some people are just monsters or maniacs, He certainly was more impulsive and passionate than I think some of the other characters in the book. And a lot of his problems stemmed from his impulsive decision making, especially financially. But he did seem to be actively working on it. And she made him better than he was.
Well, I mean, he chose very well with his wife, and the fact that he was willing to submit to what his three daughters used to call it off, mother dusting off father.
Yeah.
So he realized that he had these flaws in his nature. And, Livy, who had grown up with great wealth, she had an exquisite sense of tact. She was a Stoic. She saw things very clearly. She was very, very reasonable. She was amazingly patient and loving, with her husband, recognized that he was a genius, but it was a tremendous effort to keep this man on an even keel, someone whose mind, it's interesting to write about genius like Mark Twain, because his mind is bursting with ideas all the time. He's smoking 40 cigars a day, and that kept him up all night, and then he'd have to drink ale to kind of offset the effect of the cigars.
She was a Victorian, and he was not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he really needed her. I just love the whole story, of how they met, because he blows into her life like a tornado.
Yeah.
And she was very fragile. She was very delicate, very refined, very proper. And the Langdons were a very rich family from Elmira, New York. Jervis Langdon had made a fortune in rail, coal, and timber. And suddenly here's this tornado who has shown up on their doorstep and is very much, he wrote Livy 200 love letters wooing her. She actually would annotate the letters. So finally, the Langdons saw how serious Mark Twain was. And so Jervis Langdon asked him to have 10 people out west, where Twain had been, to send letters of recommendation. So the 10 letters come in, and they all describe him as idle and lecherous, and he's lazy, and he drinks too much, and they're all terrible letters. So Jervis Langdon sits down with Mark Twain and says, "Don't you have a friend in the world?"
Yeah.
And Mark Twain kind of shrugged his shoulders, abashed, and says, "I guess not." And Jervis Langdon miraculously says to him, "Well, I'll be your friend. Take the girl. I know them better than you do." And actually, it was quite an inspired decision, because Twain had been a pretty loose character out west, and that they saw not only his genius, but that there was something very genuine, and his love for Livy was total, and it was reciprocated. And there is scarcely a letter that Livy writes to Mark Twain that does not end, "I adore you, I idolize you, I worship you." And when he would be out on the road lecturing, she would write to him, "Life is somehow much more interesting when you're around." I think that he was the kind of difficult husband, but there was never a dull day.
Well, I grew up in Sacramento, and we learned a lot about the sort of mining towns and camps in Calaveras County. So I grew up hearing a lot about Mark Twain, and it wasn't until my parents lived near Incline Village now, and I was visiting them, 8 or 9 years ago. I went for a run, and I'm running up along this beautiful trail. I'm looking down over the lake, and there's this sign just in the middle of nowhere, like a historical sign, and it's like, "This is where Mark Twain nearly burnt down all of Lake Tahoe." Oh. And I remember thinking, he would have been famous just for this. Like, he would have been the guy that started the Chicago fire, or, was responsible for some natural disaster that we all know about.
Right. That actually happened. I mean, Lake Tahoe was called Lake Bigler at the time, and he went out there with a friend. They had bought a small stake there, and they spent days just gliding on a canoe. Mark Twain loved nothing more throughout his life than being on the water. And then they're, cooking at this campfire. And they managed to set on fire the forest land that they had just bought. It's kind of very Mark Twain image that wherever, he goes, chaos follows. Yeah, and it's funny because, he then goes out. His first book, The Innocents Abroad, he does this tourist cruise to Europe and the Holy Land. They see the Sea of Galilee, and he says, Lake Tahoe is much more beautiful.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's one of the wonders of the earth.
Yeah, it really.
When I was reading your Twain book, I was thinking of a quote from Dean Acheson, I think. He was saying that the remarkable thing about Harry Truman was his capacity to change. Mm-hmm. And Truman's born to slave-owning parents, racism. Yeah. He's part of the system. And from where he began to where he ended up is almost inconceivable. The amount of change and breaking down of prejudice, and Twain even more so, because Twain's able to be, in a way that I think a president is not, more a sort of an activist and a cultural critic. But just, I was blown away at the arc of Twain's sort of moral perspective on humanity. It's really beautiful. Yeah,
this is kind of a big theme in my book, because Mark Twain has been so misunderstood about this. Okay, he's born into a slave-owning family, in a slave-owning state. You read his letters when he's a teenager. It's just full of crude racist jibes, not just about blacks, Chinese, you name it. And he just grows and grows and grows. When he marries Livy Langdon, they're an abolitionist family that helped, harbor Frederick Douglass. They knew Wendell Phillips, etc. And Twain's views begin to change. He goes sort of from being a Southerner to a kind of honorary Northerner. He then writes Huck still arguably the greatest anti-slavery knowledge in language, whatever its flaws. And of course, the N-word is in there many times, but the N-word is used to expose the racism, not to celebrate it, to state the obvious. But then around the same time, something interesting happens, that he visits Yale Law School, and when he goes there to speak, he meets a brilliant young black law student named Warner T. McGuinn. And he writes to the dean, because Warner T. McGuinn, even though he was one of the best students in law school, he was living with the black school carpenter and doing odd jobs to survive. Twain writes a letter to the law school dean, offering to pay for all of Warner T. McGuinn's expenses. And he said, we have ground all the manhood out of the blacks, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it. And his friend William Dean Howells, the novelist, said that Twain personally held himself responsible for the harm that the white man had done to the black, and that paying for Warner T. McGuinn was his form of reparation. He actually used that term. There was also, I discovered, another black student, Wilson, at Lincoln College in Pennsylvania, whom he paid for. And Mark Twain, keeps going further and further. He actually says American liberty began not in 1776, but in 1865, when slavery was abolished. He mockingly says the Declaration of Independence should have said all white men, are born free and equal. And so he just continues to grow. And I think that capacity for growth is true of all the people that I have written about. They all become someone so much greater than you could possibly have imagined.
Yeah, Rockefeller goes from caring only about personal profit and maximizing things for himself to this philanthropist. Like, you got to grade them on a curve, right, from when they lived and their peculiar nature of their genius. But there is, if you're not opening up as you get older, then you're closing off. And I think you see this in other powerful, great people, that there was something pure and beautiful and wonderful about them when they were young that's long gone by the time they're at the end. But I think the ones we really admire become more open, more empathetic, more caring, more inclusive.
Yeah, more I think that Rockefeller, kind of ways a lot like, Buffett and Gates, became a bigger figure as time went on. I can remember when I was writing the Rockefeller figure, I was just so fascinated by him. I mean, talk about kind of reason, because he was somebody, in planning any kind of business move or philanthropic move. I think that all of us typically maybe think 1 or 2 steps ahead in this situation. He would think like 6 or 7 steps ahead. So he was sort of never, one of his colleagues said, John could somehow not only see far, but could see around the corner. And I remember I got so fascinated by him, I called up my editor and got off and I said, I'd like to do 2 volumes on John D. Rockefeller. And she said, pretty much over my dead body. I said, why? And she said, well, if you do 2 volumes, the first volume is going to be John D. Rockefeller, the ruthless monopolist. And then the second volume is going to be John D. Rockefeller, the enlightened philanthropist. She said, the whole fascination of this story is that it was the same man.
Yeah.
Put it between 2 covers. And I think that was very, very good advice. So I have always avoided that multi-volume approach, because I want you to remember, again, like with, Mark Twain, I want you to remember that kind of, mischievous, often racist, kid running around Hannibal. Do you remember him sort of later on?
Yeah.
When he suddenly is paying his reparations, to Warren T. McGuinn. And there's a very interesting story with Warren T. McGuinn, because he goes on to become a very distinguished lawyer in Baltimore, argues a famous desegregation case. And there's a young lawyer whom he mentors in the next office named Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
And Thurgood Marshall, who thought Warren T. McGuinn was one of the greatest lawyers he'd ever met. Thurgood Marshall, of course, then goes on to argue Brown versus Board of Education and become the first Black Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. So I kind of love that through line.
The coaching tree of Mark Twain, you wouldn't think it leads to Thurgood Marshall, but it does.
Yeah, to Brown versus Board of Education.
I'd be curious, what do you think that was in Twain? Is it the novelist's ability and empathy to see through and to the core of people and things? Or was it some, for Grant, he has like his mother's influence, and that's this sort of decency that is combating against his father's, what is it in Twain that allows him to not just go from this sort of ruffian, mischievous, Confederate sympathizer to where he ends up, which is essentially right on all the big political and cultural issues of his time, far ahead of his time. I mean, he's anti-colonialist, he's anti-slavery, anti-racism, income inequality, and then eventually even comes around even to, sort of Native American rights, and he gets it all right in the end, but wasn't there originally.
I think that that's a good question, right? I think that part of the answer is just curiosity about people, opening yourself up to people, opening yourself up to what you can learn from other people. I tell the story in the book, okay, in 1874, he used to do a lot of his writing during the summer at his in-laws' place in Elmira, New York. One warm summer evening, they were all sitting on the porch, and there was an older Black woman named Mary Ann Cord, who was the cook. She was probably in her 60s or 70s. She had a hearty, cheerful manner. Twain was very, very fond of her. And Twain said to her on this summer evening, Auntie Cord, you always have kind of a smile on your face. You always have a kind of laughter in your lips. Have you ever had any trouble in your life? And she looks at him and she says...
Doesn't she actually say, doesn't he presumes she's never had any trouble in his life? It's actually even more...
Thank you. You're telling the story better than I am. And then she turns to him rather sarcastically and says, are you in earnest, Mr. C., Mr. Clemens? And she proceeds to tell the most hair-raising story that she had been born into slavery. She'd had in slavery a husband and 7 children. They were all simultaneously sold on the auction block. So at that instant, her husband and 7 children were torn away from her. The youngest one, Henry, was the only one she ever saw again. He ended up being a barber, probably Twain's own barber, in Elmira, New York. And then she says to him, sarcastically at the end, no, Mr. C, I ain't never had no trouble at all, in my life. And Mark Twain was the first piece under his own signature that ever appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. It was titled "The True Story is Repeated," word for word, as I heard it. And I think that it was his ability to kind of draw out the humanity of this woman who maybe had never really told anyone, the story of her life before, and this gave him a picture. He had a very powerful identification with the Black community. Strangely enough, even when he was a boy, and in his letters saying kind of terrible racist things, he spent a lot of time in the slave quarters.
Yeah.
And kind of enjoyed them personally.
Yeah.
He thought they were great storytellers. There was a kind of magic and folklore that he loved. And so I think he really liked people and, learned from people, and that these encounters made a huge impression on him.
Yeah, and the only reason I corrected you is that I was very struck by the story that there seemed to be something in Twain that his anger was directed at things that he felt people had the wool pulled over their eyes about, or that they'd been sold a false narrative or story. So it wasn't just that, slavery was wrong.
Yeah.
It's that I think he was partly reacting against this notion that he'd gotten as a kid that it wasn't wrong and that it was a positive good, and that it's only as he gets older that he realizes what's been obscured from him as he comes to see the horror of it.
Yeah, no, he said, that in the Hannibal of his boyhood, on the subject of slavery, a universal stillness reigned.
Yeah.
Nobody, you describe somebody in the street, white man hitting a black man with a stone, the black man dropped dead, no one thought twice about it. And he said that not only did the church not denounce slavery, but he said we were taught that slavery was sacred and a peculiar pet of the deity, and this creates a lot of cynicism.
Yeah,
not about religion, but about organized religion, because he felt that the church had been kind of a major in the South, a major prop of slavery.
Yeah, it's a cynicism against narratives that are telling people they don't have to think too much about something or look too far deep into it. It's like when you go, aren't sweatshops bad? And then people go, actually, and so it's whatever that kind of convenient narrative that allows something, an injustice or a wrong, to continue. It feels like Twain developed a sort of a nose for those things. So, they like us over there in the Philippines, or, actually we're civilizing and helping the Native American tribes. There was when he was younger, he accepted all these narratives, and as he gets older and learns more and starts to understand how these things get handled, he has a particular skepticism and a focus on bringing those things into the light. Yeah,
no, he was able to give up ideas that he'd previously held. When the Spanish-American War breaks out, he's actually a sort of big jingoistic supporter of it. Because he felt that really we were supporting these Cuban rebels against these Spanish overlords. It was like the American Revolution. And then, in the aftermath, we acquire control over the Philippines. And at first he naively imagines that we were going to help to establish a Philippine republic. Then he realized that we had gone there to subjugate, not to redeem them. And he was very, very courageous. He gave a speech in New York in which he got up. I think that he was the Toastmaster at the banquet. He got up and said that our soldiers in the Philippines were marching with disgraced muskets under a polluted flag. Well, it's very, very difficult. It takes a lot of courage to criticize your government in the middle of a war. In fact, even at the time, we're sort of gasping in the audience. Yeah. And one of the other speakers rushed up to say, no, our boys are not fighting with disgraced muskets under a polluted flag. He lost a lot of friends. And what's interesting is that earlier in his career, major preoccupation, because he always had strong opinions about things. He was very afraid that if people knew what he actually thought about a lot of different things, that he would alienate his readers. But then you see what happens as time goes on, particularly the last 10 years of his life. He just has the hell with it. I'm going to let it rip. In fact, the famous white suit that he dons, significantly, he calls the white suit my I don't give a damn suit. It's like we all kind of reach that moment in life where we say, I don't give a damn anymore. I'm just going to say what I felt. And it was a long time coming, for Mark Twain. But eventually we heard almost everything that he felt come out of his mouth.
Yeah, there's the tragedy of Twain is, of course, what could he have said or done had he had a level of financial security, had he not. This is the real cost of ill discipline, right? I think about this with Thomas Jefferson, right? Like Washington is able to free his slaves because he had the financial discipline to do so, right? Yeah. Like he was in a position to realize his ideals, where Jefferson's horrendous spending habits and irresponsibility makes it impossible for, he's too selfish to do something selfless. Yeah. And there's probably something about Twain too, where we lose several good books or stands or whatever that had he been a bit more disciplined and not needed an endless amount of money, so he wasn't chasing these scams, he just would have been creatively and morally more
and I think
empowered.
that there are two things, Ron. One, he and I would say Livy too, they were very, very attached to material things. Yeah. Livy actually wrote a beautiful letter in which she said, it's kind of terrible how attached we become to material things. Twain had made a fortune from his book royalties, from his lecture fees. He married an heiress. They create a 25-room house with 6 servants in Hartford. So I don't know of any other writer who was living this kind of baronial, existence. And so, Mark Twain, there's so much money there that Mark Twain could have had a very easy, placid life just writing things. But he has a speculative itch. He said, I must speculate, such being my nature. And in later life, he admits, he said, I was always the easy prey of the cheap adventurer. He invests enormous amount, in contemporary dollars, millions of dollars, in a whole series of failed inventions. And finally, he invested millions of dollars and Livy's fortune in something called a page compositor that he thought would revolutionize typesetting in the newspaper business. That goes bust. He had started his own publishing company, Charles Webster and Company, that goes bust. And, they're forced to give up the Hartford house. They're forced into exile for 9 years in order to try to economize. Even then, Ryan, they couldn't economize. Right. They're living like in this 30-room villa in Florence or this palatial hotel suite in Vienna. They really did not. And in fact, when they're living in this villa in Florence, Livy writes a letter to sister and says, we're poor as church mice. So just, they have teams of servants. Yeah. It really is kind of crazy. So they really were never able to live within their means. But the story of Mark Twain is really a tragic story because all of the hardship, the bankruptcy, he has to do this round the world tour to pay off his debts. These are all self-inflicted wounds. And interestingly, I think, he was the funniest man in American history, but he said that life is not a comedy. He said life is a tragedy with comedy sprinkled here and there in order to heighten and magnify the pain by contrast.
Oof. Yeah, in a way, he and Grant are similar.
Yeah.
There's a line from Sherman where Sherman, reflecting on Grant's fall, he said something like, he wanted to vie with fortune with all these Wall Street figures who would have given all of their money to have won one of his battles. Yeah. This idea of not being happy with what you have and the poverty of needing to also have what someone else has, it just leads to the end of so many people where it comes at an incredibly high cost because they distracts them.
Yeah, and Mark Twain's first novel was entitled The Gilded Age. That's where we get the term The Gilded Age. And it's full of satires of these money-mad characters. So someone reading that book, not knowing about his life, would figure Mark Twain would be the last person in the world who would get caught up in that.
Sure.
He was the first person to get caught up in that. In his writing, he was railing against the plutocrats. in his private life, he's doing everything in his power to become one of them. And what I discovered, with all of these inventions that he invested in, all these business ventures, he wasn't just content to make a decent return. He wanted to make a killing.
Yeah.
He wanted to become one of the richest people in the country, if not the world. He kept, it's interesting, when he was in Vienna, he wanted to invest in a new device that would print on textiles and carpets. He's known nothing about this before. In 24 hours, he thinks he's become, a world historical expert on this.
There's an ego to it.
Yeah, he writes to his friend Henry Rogers, who was one of the moguls of Standard Oil, and he said, we should buy up all the patent rights for it. We can control the entire worldwide business. He said, people will call it a trust, but let them, if they, insist, and that he would think in such grandiose terms. I talk in the book, when he and his siblings were children, their father, John Marshall Clemens, left them with 70,000 acres of largely worthless land. Yeah, in the Tennessee land. And his dying words, never give up the Tennessee land. We'll make you rich someday.
It's his rosebud.
Yeah, it's his rosebud moment, clearly. And I think in all the children, but particularly Mark Twain, it left this kind of fantasy that we're going to kind of make a killing.
Yes.
We're going to strike it rich someday.
Yeah, it's... I'm sure you've experienced this, right? It's like you can do well at what you do. You can have more than you ever dreamed of getting in your life. And then you meet someone, and I mean, this is what Twain was going through is very timely, and that, then you meet someone and they're like, oh, I made $100 million speculating in cryptocurrency. And you go, did I screw up somewhere? Like, here I am slaving over these books. And so, some idiot I went to high school with, makes two entries in a computer and is a billionaire, and that, I think, if you don't have a strong sense of self and you don't love what you do and see that as the gift, like that's been striking for me, the number of very wealthy people that I've met that what they really love is books. All they want to do is write books, right? And then you go, oh, okay, you have to remind yourself, like, I hit the lottery. And Twain struggled, I think, to realize he had the ultimate fortune in that he was incredibly rich, and all these rich people admired him and wanted what he has. That's what was the tragedy with Grant too. It's you were maybe the greatest general in history. Do you know how many billionaires fantasize about doing what you did for 1 second?
Yeah.
And that the inability to see that and to want what you have and what someone else has, that's the undoing.
Very well put. Yeah, I mean, Mark Twain had this comic gift. It was once in a generation, kind of, maybe once in a century.
Yeah.
Ability to make people laugh, to create characters, to create stories. And anyone would have, traded anything, for that, and yet he was not content with that. He had a kind of contempt for it. Early on when he starts this humor writing, he describes it as kind of a trade of a low nature. He felt that it, wasn't refined writing. There's one story that I tell in the book that after a lecture, and he was, again, the most brilliant lecturer of his day, or maybe any day, he was with a friend, and after the particularly brilliant lecture he gives, Twain is in a foul mood. And the friend asks why, and Twain says, I just entertain them. They'll wake up tomorrow morning, they won't remember a thing. He really felt that he not only wanted to make people laugh, but he wanted to educate them. One strange thing that I found, I think I found it in the margin of a book that he owned. He had a self-loathing.
Yeah.
Because he read in a book, it said that Byron detested humanity because he detested himself.
Oh.
And Twain wrote in the margin, I'm like that, So there was something in him that he was very dissatisfied with himself and his own life, which is sad because his gift was so singular. And I have to tell you, I started writing the Twain book, early in the pandemic, when a couple of blocks away from me in New York, there was kind of a big refrigerated truck where all the corpses were being kept. And I was so grateful to Mark Twain.
Yeah.
First time I've ever done a book where I was literally sitting there laughing out loud as I was doing it. Nobody is funnier. And one of the reasons the book is so long, I kept discovering these comic gems.
Yes.
And I would sit there saying, Ron, if you don't put it in, it's forgotten forever.
Yeah.
If you do put it in, it's going to become part of the Mark Twain lore. And I just think that he had such a priceless gift, but sometimes he did not appreciate that and still wanted something else.
Well, I think you have a similar gift. I was very upset reading the New York Times review, because I think that the beauty of your books is it's not just their length, but they're these little things that help you understand the person in a new way. And I imagine each one you accumulated and it means something to you, and you have to go, is it going to mean something to someone else? Is it going to matter? Is it going to resonate? But they're these deeply layered books that help you understand these figures that I think each one of them tells us something about who we all are, but then also what kind of, we need more figures like this in history. There's something about biography that's kind of, in our more cynical time, I think, like nobody believes in the great man of history theory anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And you need people who think that they can change the world and do in fact change the world.
No, in fact, whenever people ask me how I choose the subjects of my book, there's kind of a number of different things that I'm looking for. But one, I have to feel that the world is different for this person having lived. And just on that New York Times review, I think that a critic should review the book he's reading, not the book he would like to have read. Of course. And it's not, this is not, I should say, the book of Mark Twain. It's not a kind of literary critical biography where I'm going to sort of go deeply into analysis of each one of the books. What I try to do with the books, and I think actually this is the first biography, I touch on all 24 of the books that he published in his life. I'm not aware of any other biographer who has done that. But when I come to the books, I try to show what this reveals about Twain at that moment in his life, what gave rise to it. Also, there are a lot of, Twain wrote, a handful of outstanding books, Huck Finn, like From the Mississippi, etc. There are a lot of books that he wrote that are really second rate.
Yeah.
But, I read them, and what I try to do, so I said, no one is ever going to read, The American Claimant. There are all these forgotten books. But sometimes there would be really just a comic gem in the middle of them.
Yeah.
And so let me see if I can
bring that back,
preserve that. But, sometimes a critic will kind of think along with you, and then another time they will fight you. Mark Twain made a comment on critics. He said, it's kind of the most degraded of all trades. And he said, but the Lord has willed that we have critics and missionaries and humorists and other people, and we will have to bear that burden. Well, it's actually, it's funny you should mention that because, I was reading your book on the plane down, and when you publish a book, we've now had 31 reviews, of which 28 have been raves.
Yeah.
But it's one of those moments where you're especially aware that you cannot control your environment. You cannot control what people say. Tongues will wag. It's not always funny to have all these people sort of chattering about you. And so you have to learn to have a certain philosophic detachment from the whole thing.
Totally. Yeah, you control. Well, what Stoicism has taught me about being a writer is that my ambition has to be in the book, not in what people say about the book.
Yeah.
Right? Like my ambition is towards the part of it that I control.
Yeah.
Like what I control is, did I do the work? Did I realize what I was trying to do? Did I do my best? It's all in that part. And then you have to be accepting of what other people say and do about it, because you don't control that. You don't have to like it necessarily.
Yeah,
but
and
it is what
I've
it is.
been very lucky, because I have developed a very, very loyal readership of people.
I mean, I did the math. I've read 4,200 pages of Ron Chernow books.
Well, thank you. You're sort of an example of what I'm about to say. My readers don't particularly care what this, that, or the other reviewer says. And actually, I find, and it's sort of nice going out and doing publicity because I meet a lot of people like you who are loyal readers. I find, and I get letters from them, I find very often just what, ordinary readers say about the books are, to me, much more insightful
Sure.
than what the professional reviewers
Always.
say, and that they appreciate the book in exactly the spirit in which I wrote it. And so I kind of feel very lucky with that. But reviewers will always be with us.
I read Hamilton close to when it came out and loved it. And my 8-year-old somehow found the musical and is obsessed. So,
oh my goodness, is this your...
Yeah, Clark, you want to come in? You want to sit in the chair? He's a big Hamilton fan.
It's a pleasure to meet you. What's your name?
Clark.
Clark.
Did you have any questions?
Yes. Why did you make a book about Hamilton?
Well, you'll find this interesting, Clark. I started writing this book in 1998, I suspect, before you were born. And at the time that I started writing about Alexander Hamilton, he was a forgotten figure. No one knew who he was. Maybe they knew he was the guy on the $10 bill. Maybe they knew he had died in a duel with Aaron Burr, but that was it. But I started reading about his life, and I thought it was the most exciting personal story I'd ever encountered. And his achievements were much greater than that of some of the other founders that we knew very well. And so it has pleased me to no end that because of the success of the musical, so many people, Alexander Hamilton is now not only known, but is their favorite founding father. Tell me what you like about the musical.
Well, I like how they didn't use, we read this article, and when they said history has its eyes on you, they said it sounds like God has its eyes on you, but they used history because they didn't want it to be religious.
Uh-huh.
I also have another question that's, when you were writing the book, did you think there would be a musical about it and a play about it?
That's an excellent question. Hate to say it, Ryan, he should be doing the interviews.
He's much better than me. Yeah.
It's an excellent question. Okay, when the book appeared in 2004, it was optioned for a feature film in Hollywood. That is, Hollywood would buy the right temporarily to consider doing this. And we had this happen 3 times. So our expectation was that there would be a feature film of Alexander Hamilton. And then one day in 2008, I found out that someone named Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was starring in his first musical on Broadway, which was called In the Heights, had read my Hamilton book and had become obsessed with it. And I met him. I went backstage. He invited me to a Sunday matinee. I went backstage. And I said, "So, Lynn, I hear my book made an impression on you." And he said, "Ron, as I was reading your book on vacation, hip-hop songs started rising off the page." And this was not a typical reaction to one of my books. And he's told me that he wanted to. At that point, he thought it might be just a concept album rather than a full-blown musical. And he asked me to be the historical advisor. And I laughed and I said, "You mean you want me to tell you when something is wrong?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "I want the historians to take this seriously." So I became the advisor to this still non-existent show. The reason that I said yes to Lynn about being an advisor to the show was not because I thought it would be a sensation. It seemed like a very unlikely topic for a Broadway musical. I said yes to him because I'd been a lifelong theater goer. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to watch the development of a show from the other side of the footlights? And it was one of the greatest experiences imaginable. And during the 7 years that I worked with Lynn on this show, every single person we thought, without exception, thought it was the single silliest idea for a musical they had ever heard. And as Lynn likes to say, they're not laughing now.
So basically, when you were writing the book, were you trying to make it interesting?
Well, yes, because I write, as you can see, long books. And I think
listening to the audiobook.
I think that the longer the book, you better make it interesting, because no one wants to read a long book. But you have to make this so interesting and so exciting that people will keep turning the pages. And so, the way that I try to do that is by humanizing Hamilton as a character, that he seems like such an extraordinary figure leading these very dramatic events that you want to find out what happened next and what happened next. If I can't make him interesting, I can't make a living doing what I do.
So when you were writing the book, what was like the hardest part? Like, did you have to look and check a lot of stuff?
The hardest part of writing the book was that Alexander Hamilton was a human word machine. His papers fill 32 very thick volumes, and I had to read all of them. And it was sort of difficult to keep up with just the massive amount of material. It was a little hard on my ego, Clark, to write about a writer who was a much better writer than I was.
When you were like writing the book and doing the history, what was your part of the history that made you laugh the most?
That made me laugh the most? I don't know in Hamilton that there were a lot of laughs exactly.
I can think of one.
Can you think of one? Right?
Remember the one about where
the parapet?
Yeah,
the fat general parapet.
Remind me of
and
that.
the hurricane.
There was a scene where I think it's the Battle of Yorktown, where Hamilton is hiding behind a rather large general, and he demands that he stop using him as a parapet.
Oh,
Clark thought that was hilarious.
Okay. See, this is what happens, Clark, when you go out on the road. You discover that your readers remember the books better than you do. I think because my books are long, it's like the hard drive of my brain can only hold one book at a time. And each new book kind of drives out the other. So sometimes I meet someone, they've just finished a book that I wrote 30 years ago that I've mostly forgotten, and they have the book at their fingertips, and then they can't quite believe that I'm the guy who wrote the book because I seem so dumb and forgetful.
Clarky, I brought your playbill if you want him to sign it. See my Hamilton book right there? This is from when we saw Hamilton. I think I wanted to sign it for you, I bet.
Will you sign this?
Yeah, Java. Ryan, I think your successor
I know.
is right here.
He's he knows what he's doing. What was your favorite part of the play, Clarky?
Probably seeing Philip for the first time and how bad the hair costume was. How they got a grown man to play it.
Oh, to play a kid?
Yeah.
We
What was your favorite song?
Battle of Yorktown and always Alexander Hamilton.
You can do it probably from memory. But he listens to it every night when you go to bed, right?
Yes.
That's what he falls asleep.
Can you do the first number with me? How does a bastard orphan, son of a whore, and a Scotsman dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean, by providence impoverished in squalor, grew up to be a hero and a scholar. The $10 founding father without a father got a lot farther by working a lot hard, by being a self-starter. By 14, they placed him in charge of a trading charter. And every day while slaves were being slaughtered and carted away across the waves, he struggled and kept his guard up. Inside he was longing for something to be a part of. The brother was ready to beg, steal, borrow, and barter. Then a hurricane came and devastation reigned. Our man saw his future dripping down the drain. Put a pencil to his temple, connected it to his brain, and he wrote his first refrain, a testament to his pain. Okay, that's as far as I can remember.
That's amazing. That was so cool. Clarky, I'm really proud of you. You want to show him the bookstore?